All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules Experience podcast, whatever it is you guys like to call it. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, Lev Po on Twitter, and we are here today to talk about the various branches of Christianity, as well as why certain ones are considered to be heretical. And with us, we have, for the first time, Michael Jones. It is a great pleasure to have you here with us today. You are an inspiring person, so goes your name, Inspiring Philosophy on YouTube. Great channel. I recommend everybody to check it out. Even if you are not a Christian, even if you are a heretic, I highly recommend checking the videos out because I think that it's going to have many things that you're going to resonate with. And of course, back with us, the great Neil, Gnostic Informant. Here. Got the raw milk in hand for this stream. This is my only dinner today, and I am ready to be astounded by the conversation that's about to take place. Here we go. I guess the only thing that I should say off the bat is everybody click that subscribe button. No, smash that subscribe button. Smash the like button. Click the bell. That's extremely important. And if you want to help the channel that brings everybody together, which is Break the Rules, you gotta support through Patreon, patreon.com/breaktherules. Anyway, with that being said, I would love to get an introduction from Michael. Please tell us about how you became Christian, were you raised Christian, and what inspired you to start your channel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I apologize, everyone. I am a little sick right now, so hence the blanket. I'm a little slight fever, so I apologize if I seem a little off. My doctor said the only prescription is more cowbell, but unfortunately CVS didn't have any for some odd reason. Don't know why. But yeah, my name is Michael Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy. I was raised in a very young earth fundamentalist type church, kind of became a deist for a little while, and then eventually came back and became Christian and got into apologetics after that. And around the early 2000s, when YouTube was just sort of coming out, I noticed there wasn't a lot of Christians on there. And I had a nighttime security job where I didn't do anything. So I started making videos in about 2011 and have been doing them since.
Excellent.
Wow.
And for those who do not know Neil, although I think that your two channels do intertwine, with the great Derek Lambert, Myth Vision. So, Neil, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure, man. I didn't grow up in any fundamentalist household whatsoever. Just an average. Like I had an Italian family, so they were just by default Catholic on that side of the family. But it was like twice a year. You go to Easter, you go to Christmas. Sometimes we didn't even go. It's just like, we'll do it next year. Like it was that laid back. But my getting into it was when I started to. I was an addict for a while. Ended up in prison, and that's where I started reading the Bible. And I was in there, read the whole thing cover to cover, became very was grabbed by it. Was like it was speaking to me. These parables about the son who got lost his way, and he was out in the world spending all of his inheritance on just whatever, on alcohol, and he comes back and the father's like, yeah, we're gonna throw a party for you, and the other son's like, what the hell? I've been here the whole time. What about me? And he's like, no, this is a good day. Our son is back, and we should celebrate that. I thought that was me. I was that son. I was screwed up. I was out there in the streets doing all this crazy stuff.
Prodigal son.
Right. So I got saved. I went to the born again side for years, 5 years about. Church twice a week, real into it. And in fact, it's funny because the topic of today is sort of the reason why I sort of left the faith. Was I didn't number one, I kind of studied my way out in terms of the historicity of things, but what I can't understand about today's Christianity and what I have a problem with is the idea of this sort of dogmatism, in the sense, not all Christians, I don't even think you at all, or I'm talking about like this sort of idea of these evangelical Baptist Christians who sort of think it's like, patriotism and Christianity are together, and they're always in that way. That sort of threw me off. You know what I mean? And
yeah, so, Jesus with the machine gun and the American flag behind him flying on, and the bald eagle.
Yeah. I'm confused. When you were a Christian, you didn't get your Republican card. You're supposed to get that in the mail. Like, yeah, Jesus sends it out to you.
Yeah, I missed mine. I was at the wrong address. So, but anyways, no, I was part of those kind of churches. I was part of the churches that was Trump is chosen. Like I had a pastor who that. Yeah, I had a pastor who said that. He said, if you don't vote for Trump,
hate that crap.
Yeah, I'm glad we can agree on that. But it sort of brings the topic of heretics, because these type of churches will say you're a heretic if you vote Democrat. You know what I mean? And so, but we don't have to just talk about today's Christianity. We can go back to the early church and how the idea of heresy even arose. So I want to get to sort of that thing too. And I guess that's where I'll start off at.
Well, let's start at the top then, as far as what were let's say even before Christianity, what were the movements that then led to what became the Christianity all of us know and love today, along with the aforementioned heresies?
Yeah, so talking about heresy itself, I mean, Christianity does come out of Judaism, very much so. And we can see the same kind of idea of heretics or people outside of the Orthodox faith or Second Temple Judaism. So, for example, we see, of course, the disputes between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and you see texts where they're both sort of attacking each other. Pharisees, more of their texts have survived, so them sort of attacking the Sadducees. And then you see even within the Pharisee groups, there's also splits. So you'll see there's one Jewish text, I can't remember where it is, but it's woe to you, Galilee, for you hate the Torah. And it was basically scholars will notice it was an internal Pharisee type thing. The Pharisees in Jerusalem were more pure in their own mind, and the Galilean Pharisees, or those ones up there, they did not get the Torah like they did. So it tends to be this sort of idea, it's if you're not doing things the way we think you're doing, then you're outside of the group or you're a heretic in that sense. And that's generally something we see in all religions, different groups. You could see it even in philosophies. Even you could say that maybe there were certain people that were Stoics and they became Epicureans, I believe is the term. They would have been considered a heretic, even though they may not have used that term. But you get the idea that they sort of leave their former philosophy and they go into something else. So heresy just seems to be a term we've applied to someone who is, or a heretic seems to be a term we've applied to someone who sort of leaves what we would consider the right beliefs and they now believe something different.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting about Christianity itself, it sort of comes out as a heresy in its own self if you compare it to some of these Sadducees who are, only looking at the Torah. We don't really care about all this Greek stuff. But then you get people like Philo, who literally is saying that Plato is holy. And he's revering some of these Greek philosophers. He's talking about Orpheus. He's talking about some of these other myths, and you could see this sort of Philonic Judaism where I feel like Christianity, especially Christian theology, sort of comes out of that. And so when you look at it from its birth being like that, right? If that's the case, for me, it makes sense why when I look back at the 2nd century Christianity, for example, when you see all these different diverse groups, the Carpocratians, the Nacenes, the Marcionites, all these different groups, they have completely different worldviews on things. They all agree that Jesus is the Messiah. Some of them might not think he's exactly the same as God. Some of them do. There's a huge wide range. And for me, I feel like that was normal. And I think if it would have kept along that way, I think Christianity would still be thriving right now. Not that it's not the most dominant religion in the West, but I think it'd be doing a lot better. That's what I think.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying if Christianity was more Gnostic? Because you mentioned Gnostic groups.
Yeah, Gnostic. Well, what is Gnostic? I mean, is it just faith through? I define Gnostic as salvation through gnosis rather than faith. Other people will say everything I just said is Gnostic, but it's not true. Gnostic is a word that Irenaeus and Hippolytus call heretics. They're all Christians in my opinion. They're all just Christian varieties. Even the Nicene preacher who equates Jesus with Attis and Adonis. What's wrong with that? He's looking around at other sacred stories and saying, well, they thought they were worshiping Attis, but they were really worshiping the Christ. I think that should be a perfectly plausible Christian theology, in my opinion.
Well, if we can go back a little bit to when Christianity first started, can we thread the path of Christianity as it is today, as it is considered to be the true Christianity, and then where exactly did it start to divert into other interpretations?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd push back, and I would say that a lot of these other groups, like these Gnostic groups, they sort of come about after Christianity spreads out of the area of Judea. Gnosticism itself is not just Christian. Philo talked about Jewish Gnostic groups before. So I mean, there was also Zoroastrian Gnostic groups. It's just as you mentioned. I would say it's salvation through secret knowledge. In Gnosticism, it's about what you know. In Christianity, it's about who you know, which is Jesus. That kind of the difference there. And these Gnostic groups were very good at syncretism. They were very good because they worked a lot through analogy. We've heard this story, we've heard this tale, we can interpret it in this analogous way to fit with the sort of idea of revealing secret knowledge or having secret knowledge. So they're very good about incorporating, syncretizing other faiths. So as Christianity spreads out, we see Gnostic groups like Sessites, Cainites start to take roots in places like Egypt, which seems to be a pretty big Gnostic place. Sure. But the reason why we would say that Gnostic groups today and ancient Gnostic groups were heretical was because they rejected essential Christian doctrines. They sort of took Christian ideas, incorporated into the already syncretized with the Gnostic ideas about secret knowledge, reworked some of the stories of Jesus to fit with the Gnostic idea, came up with their own gospels, this kind of thing. And early church fathers, the direct descendants of the apostles like Ignatius and Polycarp, did respond to them and did deal with a lot of their views and saying, well, you're not believing the faith that's been handed down to the apostles. So within Christianity, the reason why we would say these Gnostic groups were heretical, they were not Christian, is because they started rejecting essential Christian doctrines. They started taking Christian stories, Christian ideas, reinterpreting it within a Gnostic framework, syncretizing that kind of idea. And the early Christians were basically like, no, you're not believing the faith that we've got from the apostles, they got from Jesus. So therefore this is heretical.
Oh, before Neil responds, there was a super chat from Myth Vision Podcast, our friend Derek, who says, here is my indulgence for my heresy question. What standard in the 1st century classifies as heretical? What's up, Lev? So, Michael, what would be the standards?
What standard in the 1st century classifies as heretical? So if I'm understanding the question right, I would say it's rejecting the essential doctrines that were handed down by the church, the apostles, Christ. So Gnostics, for example, denied Jesus physically died and rose again to atone for sins.
Not all of them did that. Like I'm just going to jump. I don't mean to cut you off, but when you say Gnostics believe, like this is why I don't like using that term, because there's a lot of different Christian heretic groups that don't necessarily believe that.
Yeah, Gnosticism is a blanket term for sure.
But I just wanted to make sure that what are you talking about specifically any specific group that doesn't believe that Jesus was? I mean, it's true that you're right. There are some groups that would be considered Gnostic that did think that Jesus was just a guy. Sure. But I don't think all of them thought that. You know what I mean? And they're still considered heretics for other reasons.
Right. So what I'm saying is that it's like this. There were essential Christian doctrines. If you deny, you got to accept all of them to be a Christian. So for example, let's take Jehovah.
According to who?
According to the faith handed down from the apostles to the church fathers. Is kind of
right. But where do we? But that's okay. This is what we're going to need to get to. We need to get to, because we have the Nicene Creed that comes way later, and I think that's what most Christians agree on today. But how do we? Because these early Christians that are considered heretics by these 4th century Christians, they don't know these. They don't have this idea. They're just doing what they believe is the right thing, based on their worldview, based on where they're at. You understand what I'm saying? So I guess what I'm saying is, who is it? Somewhere in Paul? Is it Jesus himself? If we just look at Jesus, like if we agree, just for the sake of argument, that everything that's documented in the Gospels from the words of Jesus, he literally said, we just based our theology off that. Then a lot of these groups that are so-called heretics, I think they're valid. I mean, the Carpocratians, for example, they're getting their ideas from the Bible, that we should all live we should all share our riches amongst each other, and sort of a very socialist type of worldview that's considered heretical later on. But they're all, I mean, even Carpocrates is literally quoting scripture for his ideas. He's not just making stuff up.
Well, I wouldn't say that's an essential Christian doctrine, this idea of, sharing.
Yeah, that was just one example, but yeah.
And, essential Christian doctrines would be accepting of the Trinity, Jesus' divinity, physical resurrection, physically died on the cross, atoning for sins, inspiration of Scripture, that Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. And typically, as far as I can tell, Gnostic groups will deny at least one or many of those doctrines, and that's why they were considered heretical.
Sure. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. And I'm not trying to be combative, but I'm trying to understand where in Scripture do we have to follow a Trinity? Where in the Scripture do we have to fit that Jesus literally has to be up on the same level as Yahweh? Because I know there are some who think he's just a prophet. Okay, you can call him a heretic, fine. We can both agree with that. But there are some of these different heretical groups that, they put him up as a divine being who attained apotheosis. But they're going to say, no, he's not the same as Yahweh, but we can pray to him, we can do all that. But that would be considered heretical, Yeah.
Well, it's because we would argue that people, early Christian writings like Mark, letters of Paul as well, teach through what they're saying that Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh. So denying that Jesus is Yahweh, the creator, one member of the Trinity that, is later formulated, but based on what Scripture taught, that when they deny these things, then they get pushed outside of orthodoxy. It's generally the idea that this is one thing I tell people. The Trinity is essential for Christianity. This is something that Orthodox Protestants and Catholics agree on. Denying the Trinity means you're outside of orthodoxy, pure and simple, because essential to Christianity is who is God, who has saved us, who are we worshiping? Well, we would say it's the triune God. And if you deny that Yahweh is triune, that Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh, that's where we have a problem. We go, okay, now, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, you're denying this something essential. This puts you outside of orthodoxy.
Where in Scripture do you see this idea that there's a Trinity?
Oh. Okay. Well, I would not say there's one verse that teaches the Trinity, but I would say that it's taught throughout Scripture, this idea that, the Father is God, Jesus is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. So we take Mark, for example. Mark does this thing where he constantly is in the genre of Greco-Roman biography. He is using Old Testament passages to talk about Jesus. This is something that I had Mike Lacone on my channel. We sort of went through this thing. So Mark 6, 48, 49. And then about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried. Well, scholars have noted that what's sort of happening in Mark 6 is he's actually quoting a passage from Job 9 about Yahweh. Behold, he passes by me. I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. Same we see later when Jesus is being on trial in Mark before the Sanhedrin. They ask him, are you the Messiah, the Son of Man? And he goes, yes, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, directly quoting Daniel 7. Mark chapter 1 opens up with this passage from Isaiah about how someone's going to come to prepare the way for Yahweh, who's going to come. Now, we would think that would be Jesus, but what we see in Mark 1:4 is that John appears. John appears baptizing, preparing the way for the Lord. So who comes right after John in Gospel of Mark? Well, it is Jesus. Then we see in the next chapter this idea of we can look at Old Testament passages about only God can forgive sins. Jesus is forgiving sins. And Mark is even putting words into the mouth of his opponents, like who can forgive sins but God? And Jesus says, well, no, I can. So that's why I am, hint, hint. So we see this, and Lacona goes through chapter after chapter after chapter, showing how Mark is taking Old Testament passages that are about Yahweh, applying them to Jesus, and then saying, see, I'm telling you right now, Jesus is Yahweh. And I'm using the genre of Greco-Roman biographies. And in that genre, you illuminate a person through their words and deeds. You tell about a person by their words and deeds. Now we see Paul doing the same thing even in his epistles. He does this in places like 1 Corinthians 8:6, referring to Deuteronomy 6:4, Romans 10:9, quoting back to Joel 2:32. I mean, I think that's a pretty clear one because it says, all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And he's saying, call upon the name of Jesus, directly referencing back to a passage in Joel about calling upon the name of the Lord. So I would say the early Christians were pretty clear in trying to say, look, we cannot be even more clear. Every time we talk about Jesus, we're quoting this Old Testament passage. We're quoting this Old Testament passage. What do you think we're trying to show you here?
Right. I mean, I get what you're saying. It's just, you could select out those passages, but what if I select out Mark 10:8-17 through 19? Jesus is on his way. A man ran up to him and said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit the eternal life? He says, why do you call me good? Only God is good.
Yep.
He doesn't say, I'm God. He doesn't say, and then what does he say after that? He tells him to He says, don't murder, don't commit adultery. He tells him to follow the law, which is very, I don't think that's what Paul would say. You know what I mean? I mean, so what do you think about someone using this as saying, look, Jesus is even saying himself that he's not the same as God?
You know, I brought this passage up when I had Lycona on my channel. We talked about this, and Jesus doesn't deny it. He asks him what he's saying when you say this. Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. So, sir, do you realize what you're saying here? You're calling me God. Now, in this context of telling the story of Jesus, this is going to be another subtle hint that he is God. Here, someone comes up and calls him good. And what does Jesus reply? If you're calling me good, you're calling me God. You know what that means? So it seems to be another subtle hint used in the genre of the Greco-Roman biography to sort of shed light on this idea. Jesus never says, oh, no, only God is good. You can't. That's not me. He says, he's asking the guy, do you realize the impact of what your claim is making? Now, with your response to Paul, notice what we're doing here. Jesus is talking to a Jewish man before his death and resurrection, before the new covenant has been instituted. And he says, you know the commandments. These are what you have to do to sort of inherit the kingdom. And he says, I've done all these things. And then Jesus says, well, you know, you're missing one thing. You lack one thing. Sell all you have to the poor. And then, of course, we know that the man is disheartened. And what does Jesus do? Turns to disciples. And his disciples say, how difficult will it be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God? And the disciples were amazed. Jesus said to them, children, how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than a rich person to enter heaven. They're astonished. They say, well, then who can be saved? Jesus says, with man it is impossible, but not with God. For all things are possible with God. And I would argue along with, like Lycona, this is another subtle reference to the fact that God is the one who needs to save us. And what do we see at the end of in Paul's epistles as well? And at the end of Mark, it's Jesus who dies on the cross and atones for sins. So again, we have another subtle hint here that Jesus is God, because he says, look, yeah, it's impossible for you to work your way into heaven through these types of things. But luckily, God is going to save you. And we see that later in Mark when Jesus atones for sins.
I have a quick question for both Michael and Neil. In the original Greek, the Septuagint, were there certain subtleties in that passage, the way that it would be said in Greek, that would give a stronger hint as to how Jesus is answering that question?
It's pretty
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, the Septuagint is quoted mostly when they're in the Gospels. Like, they're quoting the Septuagint, I think, over like 300 times. So a lot of the times when you see a quote in the New Testament of the Old Testament, it's most likely coming from the Septuagint.
Yeah. Okay, I may have missaid something. I did not mean to talk about the Old Testament, which is what the Septuagint is. I meant the original Greek that the New Testament was written in. That particular passage when Jesus was talking about him in Michael, in your case, you mean that he was saying that he was God, while Neil thinks that by that he distances himself from ever being called God. Would certain subtleties of the original Greek that this was written in give us a further clue as to which one of you is right?
I think it's straightforward. The translation's pretty good. I mean, I don't think
okay.
But
I would agree. I would appeal though to cultural context. We have to remember this is an honor-shame culture. They're very much honor challenging people. You respond with rhetorical questions. You respond by throwing a question back at somebody else. You're not direct in these types of public honor challenges. You want to sort of put the person who's come to you publicly, because none of these meetings that we see, other than like, for example, Nicodemus, who says we're told comes privately at night, all of these would have been public events. They would have been before people. And in these types of things, you've got to remember these can be perceived as honor and shame challenges. So the way Jesus is going to respond may not seem direct to us, but in an honor and shame culture, this is what we would expect, sort of responding with questions, sort of saying, hey, do you realize what you said? Do you realize the implications of your own saying? This kind of attitude is very much in that type of culture.
Yeah, I get that, but it's still very different than him saying, I'm literally, just believe in me and you'll be fine. He could have just said it right there, but he didn't. And here's the thing that trips up most people when it comes to the Trinity, is that if Jesus is a sin offering, who's getting the offering? I mean, is it himself? That he's the sin offering? Who is taking the offering? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not trying to get you on anything, but what I'm saying is the question of the Trinity seems like something that shouldn't be so solidified as in who's a heretic and who's not, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of wiggle room for people to say, well, I don't think it's really necessarily Trinity, especially when you look at the fact that there's not a single verse in any of the epistles until later on that actually says God is a Trinity. There's a triune God nature, like Philo says. We have to kind of add that in later on, which is fine. I don't care about that. What I'm saying is for someone to not agree with that should be fair game, I think.
Well, real quick, in Mark 10, Jesus does say, you know, sell all your possessions and follow me. So it's the same kind of idea of believe in me. He's saying you should follow after me like my disciples are, that same kind of sense. So we do see that in that passage.
Yeah, that's something Moses would say too. Moses, Elijah, I mean, that doesn't really make him God.
Well, I mean, in context, I would say the full essence of Mark, but I was just addressing that one aspect. Is you mentioned that we're maybe missing that idea of believe in me, but it is in there and just different words. But I'm kind of confused on where you're coming from, because
sure,
I mean, if it seems to be a salvation thing, that seems to be quite essential to Christianity. If you're going to believe in the Christian doctrines, it seems to be that believing in the whole salvation process, the idea that God saves us from our sins, is kind of essential to Christianity. And sort of saying, well, you know, you can sort of reject that and still believe and still be a Christian. Maybe I'm having a disconnect here. Maybe you can elaborate more.
And also, just to be real clear, when we're having this discussion, I want to make sure that the focus would be not just on heretical views towards Christianity, but views of Christianity within the various branches that would have appeared that are then considered heretical. So just within those particular spheres, would what Michael said be something that all of them agree on, or no?
All of them agree on what? Can you?
As far as the divinity of Jesus goes.
Yes. So the divinity of Jesus. So no, because you take, for example, Gnostic groups. I mean, they deny the God of the Old Testament. They make that disconnect. They sort of say Jesus is sort of like an aeon. Some Gnostic groups would say that kind of thing. And, you know, of course, the God of the Old Testament is a demiurge, and he's evil. And that would be sort of rejecting this idea that we see in the early Christian writings, that Jesus is God in the flesh, the same God of the Old Testament, and he did fulfill the scriptures, that kind of sense. So no, you can't just say that, well, a Gnostic just can't come along and say, well, we believe Jesus is divine. Well, what does that mean? I mean, I've talked to Hindus who think Jesus is divine. That doesn't mean they actually are. That mean they're Christians, because they believe he's like some sort of like maybe Hindu, like avatar type thing, that kind of sense. And it's like, well, no, you don't get to be a Christian just by believing Jesus is divine. You got to actually hold to the essential doctrines of what we mean when we say Jesus is divine. We mean he is Yahweh in the flesh. He fulfilled the scriptures. He is the same God that was there in the beginning, and then came in the flesh, that kind of thing. So when Gnostics come along and they say, well, we believe Jesus is divine, but they reject the atonement. And again, I know Gnosticism is a blanket term. It's just hard to talk about it without, mentioning specifics in there. But, when they say Jesus is divine, but they also, when you get into the nitty gritty detail, what that means, you go, well, this isn't Christianity anymore. This is a heretical group that sort of comes out a little bit later.
Yeah, but to say it like that, it's a hindsight way of looking at it, because like the Valentinians, for example, the Valentinians are almost lined up perfectly with a Orthodox Christianity, except they have an idea of salvation, of attaining gnosis, in the sense of becoming the most pious person you can possibly be, and then that's how you ascend up into heaven. And you got to remember too, like the world Paul is talking to, you got James and his Christianity, assuming that the James of the epistle sort of lines up with who James is. Like, that's fine, but that's a more Ebionite worldview, where it's more about the law, more about following the customs of the Torah. And then Paul has he's going out into the world, into Anatolia, into Greece, into Macedonia, and he's talking to people who are called God-fearers. They're pagans, but they're called God-fearers, and a lot of them are like, what is this Judaism thing? And so they're coming out of this Orphic tradition. They're not like pagans that are like, people think of pagans. A lot of Christians think of pagans as like, they're just wicked Dionysus worshipers having orgies everywhere. No. The Pythagoreans and the Platonists were pious God-fearers, and they were very, very well accustomed to receive someone like Paul, who's teaching this sort of new religion. And so they're looking at it like the idea of being pious and living a good life of not worrying about riches and not trying to be greedy. And those are the things that they necessarily were focused on. And so that's how you end up getting all these different groups of Christianities. And so what I think happened was this idea of if you don't believe in this one idea of how Jesus is, he's a Trinity, or else you're a heretic. That's where I think Christianity falls apart, in my opinion. I think it could have been a lot better of a religion if it allowed for people to sort of form their own private theologies. That makes sense.
That to me just drifts too far into relativism. This idea, how far do we go with that? You sort of get this.
Well,
the
ancient Greeks did pretty well with it before Christianity.
What do you mean?
You didn't have to be a worshiper of just Zeus, or you didn't have to be just a Bacchus worshiper. There was all these different outlets of spirituality, and they sort of the way the Greeks and very much in the East too, with a lot of the Vedic cultures, religion and spirituality are like an expression of the self. It's art. It's something that is like tangible, and so I think there's more you can get more out of that. Is what I'm saying, especially in terms of Christianity. That when you have all these early Christian groups, a lot of them, when you actually look at what they're saying, these are ideas that are useful. They're good. Like the Carpocratians have really good ideas on how to run a society, how to treat people, how to act, basically, instead of just, if you don't believe in this, we're going to hang you from or we're going to burn you because you're a witch or something. Like,
So let me address that really quickly. This idea of Christians persecuting, and I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about Christian history that, people like Tim O'Neill on History for Atheists have pointed out. Early Christians were not running around and like burning people. I mean, the idea of witch burning doesn't really come about until like the first 1,000 years after Christianity. And the historian Nathan Johnstone notes that a lot of these persecutions did not come about directly from Christianity, but came about from he says in his own words, it was a failure of rationalism. This idea we're going to introduce human jurists back to the equation. But in Lombard laws, for example, the first 1,000 years of Christianity say witches don't exist, and no Christian mind should believe in them. So there was this idea that they weren't really doing this hardcore persecuting that I think you might be implying. So I just want to address that. They were addressing these criticisms. They were responding. I mean, Irenaeus wrote against heresies, but this idea that they had this sort of ultimate power where they were sort of like going after heretics, we don't really see that, and especially in the first 300 years of Christianity. That does not come out.
I would agree with that. Early on, things didn't get as dogmatic as they did later on. I'll agree with that. After the Middle Ages, it gets worse. I think between the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, that's where it's like you might as well just compare it to fundamentalist Islam at that point. You could not live in Rome or in Florence or in Naples and try to set up a temple to Bacchus. What do you think would happen to you if you did that? You're done. Yeah. You're getting killed for that.
But then here's what I'm kind of curious about when it comes to how the pagan religions were treated by the governments of their time. Because what we're really talking about here is, in a way, government enforced sanctions and destruction of other people's beliefs. So during the Roman times, how were the various pagan cults treated by those governments? And would you also say, Neil, and Michael as well, that it is inevitable that Christianity as it is ends up merging with the government into this theocratic state over time? Could this have been avoided? Could that terrible time that you talked about, could that have been avoided or not?
That's my whole point. I think if we didn't have this idea of heresy or the Nicene Creed, that would have avoided it. I think I mean, I could be wrong. I would like to hear what you think about that.
So again, we don't really see a lot of that coming out until like the first 1,000 years or so later. I mean, Tom Holland even talks about it in his book Dominion. And so, yeah, you definitely see this sort of merger idea later on where they start going after heretics in ways that, like that obviously are wrong, like persecution, like the Cathars, for example, right. Much later times. Yeah. Now, did that come up? Now, is that a direct result of Christianity? I would argue not necessarily, and in building on historians like Nathan Johnstone in his book, The New Atheism, says that no, this was not something that we saw coming directly from Christianity. This was an introduction of rationalism back into the system. There was this idea we're going to move away from God's providence. We're going to start introducing human jurists. this idea that we can sort of try people and get this thing sort of going. And so he says this idea of these out of control clergy, this was a failure of rationalism to control its offspring. It was not this idea this is coming directly from Christianity. This is an idea that is coming out of a much later idea. And that's his book, The New Atheism. I had him on my channel a couple months. I interviewed him about it. But what we see in early Christianity, like look at Irenaeus, for example. He's writing against heresies. Well, Justin Martyr as well. They're responding to heretical views, but they're not saying like, oh man, I really wish the emperor would, round you up and burn you all at the stake kind of idea. So you can have Christianity that teaches that there are dogmas, there are doctrines we need to hold to, without this idea there necessarily has to be persecution. It doesn't necessarily flow like from one to the other is what I'm trying to say.
But there are examples in earlier times if we're talking about Hypatia, and I am not as well versed in whether that story is true or not, but it's not true.
No, there was, again, a lot of myths. Same with like the Library of Alexandria. This idea that Christians burned it down or killed Hypatia for being here. No. That, again, Tim O'Neill, who's an atheist, runs a channel and a blog, History for Atheists. He has addressed this through and through. Hypatia was not persecuted by Christians for rejecting Christianity or anything like that. She got caught up in a political dispute, and unfortunately, she was a casualty of that. Same with like the Library of Alexandria. There is no evidence Christians were going around trying to burn pagan literature.
You do have the story of the Serapeum in Egypt, and you have Christian sources that actually sort of have a different, lighter version of it. But if you compare it to the Serapis worshippers' stories, because we have both, you kind of find a middle ground. There's something going on there. They're not just letting them be. They're saying this temple needs to go. That's a fact. Like, so Tim O'Neill details about that, but yeah.
Well, Tim O'Neill points out that actually in the Serapeum, for example, there was a mob of pagans that were persecuting Christians and crucifying them and doing.
That's the Christian version, yeah.
Yeah, so they went in there and they kind of took care of it because of that. So again, it's a complicated history. You're right. And again, do we know the full story? Well, again, it's always going to be filtered by people.
That's what I say. You have both sides of the stories, and they're completely. We're the good guys, and they persecuted us. The other one's like, no, we're the good guys. I think there's something. If you look in the, if you take them both and look at, there's definitely something happening there between both.
So, but again, we don't see this as like a widespread thing. We can see isolated examples where something like that may have happened. But again, there's a lot of mix in there. Yeah.
But sorry.
Tim O'Neill again points out there's a lot more complexity here. There was no library burned in the Serapeum. Pagan literature was not being attacked by Christians. This was more against trying to, in his own words, it was getting the mob that was persecuting Christians held up in the Serapeum. And that's not coming from me. It's coming from an atheist.
But why would Serapis worshippers just decide all of a sudden during Theodosius' reign to start going after Christians?
Oh, well, O'Neill talks about this. I mean, Christians were going after pagan iconography and idols and destroying them, and they got pissed about it. So they responded by attacking Christians. I mean, yeah.
Wait. So don't you think that's kind of like provoking it, though, a little bit,
I mean, I don't think there's ever a reason to actually start killing people like, oh, you killed our idol, therefore we're going to kill you kind of thing. I think that's going a little too far. Now, do I agree with Christians destroying pagan idols? Absolutely not. I would love for those things to have been preserved especially from an historical perspective. They'd be really cool. But I mean, like, yeah, the history is complex here. But again, I don't think that justifies the pagans killing the Christians as they were.
Well, a quick follow-up question, if that's all right. When we're talking about not really knowing what happened in history, because it was a very long time ago, we can only rely on so much at the end of the day. If we're just being very practical and talking about, let's say, the Council of Nicaea and then the development of a religion that was supported in large part by the government at the time, if I'm not mistaken, would you say just practically something like that would lead to, as the saying goes, ultimate power corrupts ultimately? Just the fact that you have so much responsibility over the people now from this government that has this very specific religion that they're in favor of. Would you say that would create more of these conflicts that we may not even know about right now, but just knowing the nature of human beings?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's just the doctrine of original sin. I mean, of course, we're going to expect power to corrupt. And of course, I am all for keeping religion out of governments. I'm all for that separation, especially on the federal level. So yeah, I think that was a problem. Taking Christianity, especially with Theodosius, making it such like sort of like a state level thing. And of course, we see other Christians later pushing back against this, like the monk Alcuin, for example, under the Frankish emperor. What's his name? Charlemagne. Charlemagne was forcibly converting Germanic Christians, and Alcuin said, "Stop doing this. That's not the way Christianity is supposed to work. You should not. People need to freely accept this, not be forced upon them."
But back to the original question, do you think that there is something within Christianity that inevitably led to it being adopted in that way, or could there have been an alternate reality where people would have just chosen on their own to either be Christians or not? That's what I'm really trying to figure out here.
So are you asking, is there something inherent in Christianity that leads to sort of like a state controlling?
Can I ask, let me ask this. How about this might be a better question?
Okay.
Don't you think that if there was no state decree from an emperor or somebody to say that has to be this way and you have to follow this, this, and this, or else, if you let people like we have right now here in America, you can worship however you want. You can worship the tree next to your house if you want. Don't you think that would make a better society?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course, I believe in freedom of religion.
And just one more thing. Don't you think that would have prevented all of this heretical, all these trials, all these inquisitions, if we just started it off that way, right?
Well, I mean, I would say Christianity did start off that way. They were not in power.
No, that's true. That's true. It started off what I'm saying is, if it never got to the point where there was creeds, is what I'm saying. I should have said it that way.
No, I think creeds are essential to help define what we believe Scripture teaches. I think that's quite essential to understanding, sort of beliefs. I mean, I think Mormons have every right to establish what they believe. Jehovah's Witnesses have right.
Right, but what I'm saying is like state creeds where the government says.
Again, I am all against state-run religions controlling things. I just did a video recently on Christian nationalism, where I pointed out that I talked about in the video that there's studies showing that Christianity, especially within the past couple hundred years, has led to more democracy, political stability, political transformation, voice and accountability, citizen empowerment. Studies done by like Robert Woodbury, Ronald de Salem, and the like have shown using actual scientific models that Christianity has led to these types of ideas.
Now, I have to push on that. So
go for it.
How do we
got the studies?
I know, I get that.
I have the documents.
There's a study for everything, I guess. But let's just talk real here. Let's be like logically here. What took so long? When we have a world pre-Christianity, we already have a world with democracies, with constitutional republics. All these ideas are already in place. Then we get Christianity. Then we go backwards for a little while, and then all of a sudden, I'm speeding up here, but I'll let you push back as much as you want. Just let me finish this off. Then we get to a point in time, and for the Enlightenment, where you have more liberal ideas going back and looking at people like Democritus and Epicureans and people who aren't Christians and borrowing their ideas, the Athenian laws, and going backwards, like even the founding fathers like Jefferson and all and Franklin. They're saying they're basically deists who are basically saying the Greeks had it right. We need to go back to that. And so how does Christianity get credited for, and what took so long, basically?
So the question, what took so long? So for example, we need to remember that history is complex. There's a lot of things that are also, for the first 300 years, Christians are just being persecuted. They're just trying to survive at this point. They don't have any sort of power. The missionaries are doing is just trying to work within the Roman Empire themselves. Then we see, for example, Tom Holland's book Dominion notes that we do start to see early freedom type ideas start to show up. You have Gregory Nyssa talking about abolition quite early on. You have the monk Alcuin, for example, advocating for freedom as well. This idea there should be more free education. We need to educate the people. People cannot be forcibly converted. But of course, we see also through this time there was a global cooling period that did sort of slow this sort of progress thing down. There was also Viking raids. You had Muslim raids. A lot of times, or for the past 2,000 years, sometimes they were just focused on other stuff. But once we see Christianity, Europe sort of get like some breathing room, get some space where they don't have to worry about constant wars, constant incursions, this kind of thing. They start branching out. Then we start to see missionary routes, as Robert Woodbury has demonstrated in his models, start to encourage these types of ideas. They start to become anti-colonial in their movements, start to establish these types of freedom things. So I would say that we do actually see hints of it, as Tom Holland has documented. But of course, we don't really get to see the full fruition of it until we get more breathing room, when there's a lot less external forces that, you know, people in Europe are having to deal with and having to struggle through. I mean, if you're a medieval peasant in the 700s, you're more worried about Viking incursions and growing food and just trying to get through these hard times at that point. You're not really going to get the full effects until we start to see a little bit more stabilized Europe, is what I'm saying. But
then, okay, so when we look at individual freedoms and liberalism coming out of France and America as well, they're opposing the last, let's say, 200-300 years of the theocratic rule, not just by the Catholic Church, but also Anglican Church and Lutheran Church, who had their strongholds in their Germany and England. And they're looking at this whole church and state thing and saying, this is a bad idea. And once we get away from that, things start to get better. Don't you think it's the opposite? Or I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's what they would argue in the models. They said it was a missionary route thing. It was Christian missionaries encouraged these type things.
What time period is this? Just wondering.
So I think Woodbury basically says 1700s up to the 20th century is what he uses, and Salem uses something similar as well. But we'll see these in a lot of places like India, Africa, and the Americas as well, where they're affecting these things.
And I'm sure the data is plausible, but isn't there another factor outside of this stuff, as in liberal movements, constitutional republics, democracy, being they're working within those systems, so they sort of have no choice but to go along with the new trend of the world. Don't you think that's sort of a factor too?
Well, of course it's a factor. They calculate that in their models, and they run these robustness tests, and they check for factors as well. And we're not saying that Christianity is the only factor. Let's be clear. They're saying it is one factor among many. Never once would a sociologist or historian say there's just one factor that leads to something. There's always going to be multiple factors.
Because I'll even throw you a bone here, because Christianity, in its context of some of the ideas coming from the parables of Jesus, for example, they would have been seen as SJW for the time period. Seriously, Jesus was very liberal for his time period for some of the things he said. That doesn't mean that there are other parts in some of the epistles of Paul, for example, where there are some things that that sound kind of okay,
right, come with the sword and all that.
We can drop that stuff. But I'll give you that point where the idea of Christian morality sort of gets embedded within Western culture, and then you have the idea of being good to people. I'm fine with giving Christianity some credit for that.
I'm total agreement with you. It's not the only factor. There's multiple factors.
Sure. Unless you had something else to say, I was going to ask you about the idea of the apostles handing down their idea of what's the right way to do Christianity, and how do we trace that? How do we know? Because Marcion, for example, claims that he was learning from Paul's people, and then you have Carpocratians who say, or Carpocrates, I forgot the name of his father, was apostle of John, or they all have their claims to these. They're all claiming to be from the source. And how do we know who's right and who's not?
Right. I mean, that's a good question. I could, of course, do apostolic succession as well. The argument would be is that what are the earliest writings we see, and what scholars would say? And they would say, of course, Paul's letters, Gospel of Mark, and then the other Gospels as well that come after that. And I would argue these are far more in line with the orthodoxy that we have today. It's not more in line with these other groups that we see coming out in the 2nd century, like Marcion's views. We would say those views do not seem to be in line with the earliest Christian writings that we have, like dating Mark or dating Paul's epistles. So again, it goes back to the New Testament and what we would say it actually gives us.
Now, it's funny. Now, when I read Paul, I get the impression that Paul is just kind of laid back in what people believe in, as long as you believe in Jesus. Like, he's kind of like, I might hang out with some pagans, and they might offer an offering to a pagan god, and they might, I might eat their burnt offering that's to Zeus. I don't believe in Zeus, so who cares? It's fair game. I like that mentality, but I don't. I
would agree with you to an extent, but I'd push back a little bit elsewhere.
Oh,
well, I just want to make sure that we pin something down that's been kind of itching at me from the last question that I was asking. If there was a hypothetical scenario where the government would have wanted to institute Zeusism, or some kind of a particular cult, they would have elevated it, would they have been able to get away with that or not? Because you talked about proselytization, and that's a very interesting thing to me, because in Judaism, Jews don't proselytize unless you count like the Orthodox proselytizing to other non-Orthodox Jews. In Christianity and in Islam, there is this proselytization. Would you see that as being a factor that's also not present within pagan religions, that also may lead more than any potential pagan religion to having the government being involved? Or am I drawing a connection that's not really there?
So I would say that we do see the government definitely involved early with especially emperor worship, and Christians were persecuted for not sacrificing to the emperor. They were not participating. And I mean, Christians were declared atheists because they did not partake in the typical festivals of the day. So they were persecuted for that. So we do see that coming out of pagan ideas, this idea, you're different from us, therefore we're going to persecute you.
Well, it's funny you say that, because the era from Augustus, will say Augustus down to when Constantine, throughout that period, you're right. You didn't worship the emperor first and foremost, you were in trouble. But they also let you do your own thing outside of that. And so that that sort of model, like if the Roman Empire decided Christianity is the way and we're going to make it our state religion, you could still have that model, I think. And by the way, Augustus's reforms, he was very much in line with Christian thinking of, traditional values, marriage, stuff like that,
Well, there is one issue Christians did push back on with Augustus, and that was one of Augustus's laws was like widows have to be married after 2 years, and Christians, I believe Rodney Stark talks about it, were paying the fine so widows did not have to get remarried.
Sure.
So there was a little bit different of traditions along the way there.
And that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. There should always be I think, to address something like that, we should always be flexible to change stuff like that.
Here's the thing. I am a virtue ethicist. And when we were talking about Paul, you said Paul was laid back. I think it's because Paul was teaching virtue ethics. You know what that is?
Yeah.
Okay,
I would say, yeah.
So like what he's sort of doing is he's saying like, stop worrying about rigorous laws you necessarily have to follow. Not all, you say, all is lawful, but not all is helpful. You should be focusing on how to build a virtuous character. And sure, maybe eating meat that was sacrificed to Zeus is not going to affect that. But if it's going to cause your brother to stumble, then that's an issue you need to take account, because it's about building this virtuous character. So there's very much this idea that Paul may be a little laid back because he's not so rigorous on laws, but I would say he is quite rigorous when it comes to doctrines.
Sure, and but that's the thing about Paul that I think what made him so successful is he was able to understand the diversity of the Greek world, and that's what made Paul was genius in that sense. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, I don't know, like what I guess what I'm saying is, what happened to that flexibility,
Well, I think I've argued that Christians should be more flexible when it comes to ethics, but not in doctrines. So like I did TikTok videos where I said it's okay for Christians to swear because that's not affecting a virtuous character. I mean, like if I said, oh shit, I stubbed my toe, that's not a sin, but it would be a sin if I said, hey, Neil, you're a moron. That's more of a sin than saying, oh shit, I stubbed my toe. And so we need to think about what we're doing. What is helpful? Let's not make these rigorous laws that make no sense. And so I'm all for that in terms of ethics, because if you follow the virtue ethics teachings that I think Paul and Jesus laid down, you're going to have some flexibility in these types of things. Like I'd argue that in John, I believe it's 7, Jesus lies. He lies to his brothers who see, and they say, are you going to the feast? He goes, no, I'm not. Then we see him going to the feast. Well, in the ancient world, lying was not necessarily evil if you were doing it to protect someone. The same mentality behind the idea that you have Jews hiding in your basement and the Nazis come knocking on your door, you're going to lie. That's the virtuous thing to do in that case. So the same kind of idea there. So yeah, I'm all for it when it comes to ethics, but I would say doctrines is where Christians draw the line.
Yeah, no, that to me was one of the things that even right now I would agree that Christianity did well compared to other faiths or religions. It was a very situational, like, okay, we have all these laws for Sabbath. Okay, we should maybe follow them for the most part. But there might be a situation where you might have to do something once in a while, and it's okay. And
Like the Yom Kippur War.
And the idea of being circumcised in the heart, I like that idea. It's like, okay, what are you trying to do? What do you really mean? What's in your heart? How are you as a person, rather than what you did that one day on Saturday at 4:00. You understand what I'm getting at? That to me is one of the strengths of Christianity, where I think that type of mentality is very useful. The Stoics pretty much apply that attitude as well.
Oh yeah, and I absolutely agree that is one of the strengths of virtue ethics, that flexibility that we need. That's one of the reasons I am a virtue ethicist.
And when it comes to the aspects of the more Gnostic side of Christianity that encourages more inquisitiveness, one of the things that I didn't really understand that much when I was looking at just like the lives of the medieval Christian peasants is that the Mass was in Latin. They didn't really understand what was going on from what I'm able to get. So you're living a life where you are pretty innocent when it comes to the knowledge of a lot of these things, just being told whatever it is that you're told in church. Is that enough to make a person good? Or I think this is something closer to Judaism, where there is this idea that God would value the person who would understand what it means to do evil, what evil is, so that they do not do that, as opposed to somebody like a sheep, with the bishop being their shepherd or whatever, just being in the field and not having any contact with the wolves and not even knowing that the wolves exist. Like that, I would say, would be my biggest concern when it comes to keeping people in that kind of state of ignorance, as far as whether those people can even be said to be good. Because if they were given the opportunity, if they were tested, if they were all of a sudden given some ability to do evil, like, how do you know they wouldn't? Would they even understand what they were doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you. There was a disconnect in the Middle Ages, and Robert Woodbury talks about this in some papers that when Protestant groups came along, they started trying to educate people more and to teach them Christianity, help them read the Bible. Like you had the Pilgrims at Plymouth not only translate the Bible in Algonquian, they had to invent an alphabet in Algonquian to translate the Bible. And what happened was that was actually a good thing, because Catholics started to compete with them. They started to go, okay, well, we want to compete with Protestants. We're going to start printing material and educating more. And then you had this. So people
free market, baby.
Yeah. You had this kind of competition among brothers in Christ about how we want to make sure people get educated. And the competition actually led to more education. So, it's like people get upset at the Protestant Reformation. I think it was necessary in some extent, because it sort of awoke the church to sort of compete with the Protestants. And that was a good thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. As far as that goes, I mean, that's another thing that I would say. If there wasn't a lot of all these government decrees early, I should say early on, but 4th century, you might not have this powerful church at all. You might have different institutions in different areas. One of them in Macedonia, one of them in Gaul, another one over here, and they might have like their own different systems going on, sort of like how it is now. But it would have happened faster than it did, don't you? I mean, I'm just throwing something out there. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to remember, though, that the power of the church in the Middle Ages is far overblown. Tim O'Neill talks about this, like how, like, there was one pope, I think it was Innocent II, may have been in the Middle Ages. He was going to be a really radical pope. He was going to lay down laws. And he declared, if you want to be a Christian, you need to attend Mass at least once a year. Like, very, very strict guy. I mean, the power of the church has been... What?
What do you say?
The power of the church that, is sort of portrayed in Hollywood or some movies is really overblown. They didn't have this exorbitant amount of power they wish they would have had.
Mass once a year. That's what you said. That was the requirement for the people.
That's what that's what he said. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Not very strict. And, a lot of the times, especially in the early days when there was the Holy Roman Empire still, in present day Germany, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were at war a lot of times, and they were constantly excommunicating each other.
Yeah.
So the idea the Pope had this overwhelming power and authority to do what he wanted. I mean,
and then you also have the Greek, you also have the Patriarch in Greece too, doing his own thing. Yeah, there's a lot of that, especially with the schism. I see that.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea that they had this overwhelming power they could use to enforce it, we don't really start seeing that come about until we get the Inquisition. And there was debate about what causes that. And again, the power of that is overblown. In a lot of ways, the Inquisition was more lenient than even some of the more secular governments at the time in terms of what they did. Like the whole persecution of Galileo is taken way out of context and overblown. There's a whole saga there.
But digging into that a little bit deeper, though, if we're not talking about the power of the Holy See, if we're talking about the local villages with their priests, how much power did those villages, or did those priests in the villages have over the people within their congregation?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It would probably have varied. There was the Gregorian reforms, I believe it is, that really started to solidify more centralization power. I believe about 1,000 years ago, and that's when priests were declared they could no longer marry. So prior to that, priests could marry, and they had wives, and then they said, nope, no more of this. And more power was being centralized in the Roman Church at that point, and less in more of like the local priest and his power. So we do see more like again, Tom Holland talks about this in his book Dominion, goes through the history of that and how they started. That's when they started cramping down on more like heretical movements in ways that probably was not right.
Well, I guess the other reason why I bring it up, I mean, it's not, it's become kind of a cliche today for people who are not fans of the Catholic Church to talk about, like the molesting priests and all that stuff. I just wonder when it comes to individuals being in the position of power within their local community, how much of that stuff, obviously that's not the kind of stuff that gets recorded down, how much of that stuff would have went on because that local church did command respect. But then again, what you said about the 1 time per year thing makes me think that how often did people go to church? Like maybe it wasn't really that important, or was it for like the average?
That was the thing to do. They didn't have movie theaters. You were. I mean that's why I'm bringing. And this is a big thing of why I want to bring all these topics up, because this was the central part of life. It's like what we think of now in film and art and music, which is all like how it's what builds your character, what builds who you are as a person, personality. Well, that was what religion was, and I think that more freedom for that religion is I mean, healthy, I guess,
But isn't that like watching a movie, like a foreign film without subtitles, if they're all speaking in Latin?
Right, that's a good point, and that's another thing. People in the Protestant movements were kind of going. It was one of the many things they were sort of like fighting against. But if you go back before even that, I was talking to Andrew.
Oh, wait, real quick.
Yes.
I misspoke. The Pope that made that one Mass a year thing was Innocent III, not Innocent II. So my mistake.
Sure, that's not a big deal. Innocent II was the one who went to the. He's the one who was for the Crusades, right? Yeah, I think so. But anyways,
maybe.
Yeah, I think he was.
Looked it up.
Yeah, that's a pretty good name, by the way. That kind of absolves you. You're innocent.
But anyways, what I was saying was, I was talking to Andrew. Is it Andrew Henry? Dr. Andrew Henry from Religion for Breakfast? I think that's his name. I hope I got it right. But I was talking to him about this because his main area of expertise, where he wrote his PhD dissertation on, was early Christian artifacts, amulets, stuff like that. And early on, like 4th, 5th century, a lot of these Christians would go to worship Mass on Saturday or Sunday, and then on Monday they would go to their local grotto, their local grove where they had the Odin sanctuary. They were doing both at the same time. And it was very common at the time.
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, as Christianity spread out, it was interpreted still by some in the typical pagan fashion. So this is just another god for us to worship, kind of thing. Sure. And you see, like, stories of like Saint Boniface or Saint Martin clamping down on that, and saying, "Nope, that's not how we do this."
Yeah, they were pissed.
Yeah, but I mean, these were the guys that were studying the scriptures far more in depth than like the average guy on the street, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing. The average people the average people are doing this because this is what gives them fulfillment in their lives. They're like I was saying before, they can't watch a a Steven Spielberg movie. They can't go to the bowling alley. This is what they do. Like, this is what, they read philosophy or read ancient, Homer or something. That's their entertainment. And and a part of that was reading scripture and worshiping gods. It's just part of the world at the time. What was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to say. I can't remember.
While you're trying to remember that, I also want to let everybody know, don't forget to smash that subscribe button, smash the like button, and also click the bell, which is very important, extremely important for the algorithm. Share this to as many people as you know. Break the Rules brings everybody together. And with your help, we are going to get Michael to feel a lot better, because I know that right now you're in this state right now. So even though I'm not Christian, I'm still, going to pray to the, just that you feel better, because you're a good guy, and I don't want you to feel bad. Anyway,
I remember what I was going to say now.
Nice.
So you have this lineage. I guess it comes out of Orphism. A lot of scholars say it comes out of Orphism, where you have Pythagoreanism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism, and this sort of line of philosophy that sort of coincides, and I think influences in a lot of ways Christian theology, and they sort of like are aligning throughout the centuries. And so early on, I think is like you get these Sibylline oracles, for example, and if you read the Sibylline oracles in the pseudepigrapha, you'll see, what is this, pagan? Is this Jewish, Christian? You don't know what it is. There's a mix, and there's this idea of people who are just God-fearers in general. They're not really they're not dogmatic in any direction, and I don't see what the problem with that would be. I feel like that is a better approach to religion than saying this has to be done this way. I don't know, I hope I'm not repeating myself, but I was just trying to give a better example of like where these ideas come from.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what we mean, like this has to be done this way kind of thing. Again, I don't think Christians like myself are willing to compromise on doctrines when it comes to what the Orthodox beliefs is and what it means to follow Christ. We're pretty clear that, when it comes to ethics, of course, there's going to be flexibility and depending on the various circumstances you're going into. But I mean, when it comes to doctrines,
wouldn't it be all right for you to say, this is my doctrine, I belong to this church, and this is our doctrine? You over there, you claim to be a Christian too. Well, I don't agree with your doctrine, but okay, fine.
Well, it depends on what that doctrine is. I mean, if we're talking about how to baptize, sure. If we're talking about the nature of Jesus, now we're getting something that's a little more essential.
What if they say, we'll leave you alone, you do your thing at your church, we're going to do our thing at our church. This is what we believe. We got it from the scripture. And this is from Acts 5:2. And like they show where they got it from, and they really believe that this is the case. Then what do you say?
That's freedom of religion. They can believe what they want, but I mean, I don't also have to believe that they are part of the body of Christ, is how I would say it.
I think that'd be a good. I think that would be a healthy. Like we kind of have that now, but yeah. I guess when I'm talking historically, I guess it's all like, oh, it could have been, should have been. I'm saying like, yeah, that's my whole thing,
I mean, I think that's the way a lot of the early church worked. I mean, when Valentinius became a heretic because they passed over him for the bishop role, he went out on his own and started his own own belief system, and they were like, we don't agree with you, we think you're a heretic, but they didn't go out and try to kill him or anything. I mean,
right, yeah. And I think that was a good time. And that's another thing. You see this in Judaism, in the Talmud, this idea of, and Plato and Socrates were huge on this. The idea of debates, the idea of two people who disagree on something, duking it out point by point, and then writing it down, and then letting people read it and decide for themselves who's right here. The Platonic dialogue. I think you see that in the New Testament, where you see in the book of Romans, Paul talking about it's all about faith and not works. Then you flip over to James. James says it's not just about faith. You got to do good works, idiot. Like, come on, man, do works. So that I like, and people say, oh, the Christianity is contradicting itself. I mean, it points to that. No, I think that should be the way. That's normal, healthy human interaction.
I mean, I would disagree on that James and Paul contradict, but I mean, I get where you're coming from.
Right.
I
Yeah.
guess it's when the state starts to come into the picture, that's when the time for debates is officially over, and a particular kind of way of doing things is enacted. And I think we can all agree here that's that's the fly in the ointment here. But as far as what we do now, we do have a lot of freedom of religion, you could say. We have a lot of choices. We have the internet. People can research and start to come to their own conclusions. The only downside there, I think it goes back to an older video of yours, Michael, that I told you before I really enjoyed, about the question of freedom, where there's positive freedom and negative freedom. And when it comes to people who may not be so philosophically inclined, if they were to, let's say, like Neil was saying, just decide to do their own thing or go to this particular place that they tend to resonate with the most, is there a concern that there will be some kind of a lowest common denominator effect where people are going to go to something that's just going to be like in Pinocchio, going into that pleasure island, just having a lot of fun and not really doing anything to better oneself, but because it's the lowest common denominator, more people are going to want to do that, when they're enticed to, as opposed to something a little bit more, a little bit more stoic, a little bit more quieter and self-contemplative, and something that encourages inner growth.
So if I understand you correctly, it's this comparison between more of like the lenient type thing about the pleasure island, what you were using.
Yeah.
More people doing what they want versus more like a more strict sense. I'm kind of confused on what you're trying to ask me in that, though.
What I'm trying to ask you is whether the pluralism of religions that we have today, which on one hand I could see as being a good thing, if I were to go against my own thoughts on that, I would bring something up of this nature of when there is too much choice that people have, when there isn't some kind of a hierarchical system that they consider to be the correct one because it was passed down to them from their ancestors, would it be a lot easier to fall down spiritually and socially and just become a human wreck because you just end up doing whatever it is that gives you the most pleasure? That's where you end up putting in the most time, even in terms of the kind of organization that you end up joining. That would be kind of like me fighting against myself when it comes to that belief in pluralism.
We can point to the Greeks and the Romans that were already had a world that way, and there wasn't a problem. It's not there. You still have pious people. You still have, it's not like they were running around just like having orgies every day. There was
not every day.
There was good philosophy. There was good story. Christianity came out of that world. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, Christianity clamped down on a lot of that, especially the brothels and the infanticide happening there, as well that Holland talks about.
Those ideas aren't just central to paganism as like a religion. Those are like
that's human nature.
Yeah, it's very specific. Yeah.
It's human nature, but Christianity at the same time, as you say, Michael, it was able to clamp down on that part of human nature that paganism had a harder time clamping down on. Would that be a fair assessment or no?
Well, yeah. Well, if you go back to the pagan cultures, I mean, there was a lot of things they sort of took for granted that we would deem evil, like slavery. In the Roman world, slavery was like just the status quo. You don't question it. And then Gregory of Nyssa comes along and says, no, the Bible says slavery is wrong. It should be abolished. This is what Christ would want. And of course, that was a radical idea.
But then why not just have it in the Bible? Why not just have slavery? Why not have, like, Jesus never says that. Paul, there's laws for slaves, and tell your slaves, be good to your masters. Why not just say it outright? I mean, I agree with you. There are Christians throughout history who didn't want slavery. Okay, of course. But I think it's like, that's not a Christian idea. That's a human idea. It doesn't come from the Bible is what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, as Tom Holland, Tim O'Neill would argue, I mean, the anti-slavery movements throughout the past 2,000 years were very Christian. Steven Pinker tried to argue that a lot of it came out of like Enlightenment ideas, but I mean, the abolitionist movements, especially of the past couple hundred years, were basically run by people like Quakers and Anglicans arguing that this is what the Bible taught.
Right, but then why would it have to happen 2,000? Like, okay, let's be more exact. 1,500 years. Why we have to wait 1,500 years for these things to happen?
I would argue, in line with Tom Holland's book, it took a while for things to change, for it to actually start affecting people the way it did. Like, take, for example, the idea of patriarchy. Tom Holland talks a lot in his book about patriarchy in the ancient world and how strong it was and how much control they had over women. And the church started introducing ideas like, hey, marriage should be based on romance. Marriage should be a union between one man and one woman, and fathers should not get to, use their daughters to make alliances, to sort of arrange things, use them in that kind of sense. So the church started authorizing marriages without their parents' consent, that these people could just get married because. And Holland says this started to encourage more individuality. It started to break down ancient patriarchal structures. That took time because that sort of mentality has been so embedded in the ancient mind for such a long time. It's going to take time for these ideas to filter in, for people to start to understand what these ideas are, where they're coming from, and how they're to change things. They're not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time for it to filter into the culture.
But you still have to, you still have at least 1,000-year period where church has the church has the power to make changes happen immediately, and then when abolition actually does come, it's after a time where there's a constitution set in place that is, it's so that we have the 3/5 compromise thing right before, but like these ideas are coming after there's already a whole world set in place with a system that's based on constitutional republics and democracy.
I think we're overestimating the power the church would have had throughout these ages. Like, for example, the early Frankish, kings early on were not. They tolerated a lot of the monasteries at the time, but they really were not. They were really not having power. Early, kings on the Isle of Britain
had slaves at them, though.
Some of them did, yeah. Some of them did. Right. I'm not going to deny that, yeah. But but still,
if they have slaves themselves, we can't say.
But you also have to remember that at some point, a lot of these monasteries were sort of hijacked by the states, and they started putting their own, political allies in charge of them, bringing them in. They started to get used by the state because they realized they had some sort of control over the people. So a lot of these were used by the state.
And that's part of my whole point in this whole discussion is when the state has the power to dictate what the religious decrees are, what these decrees are, then these good ideas of Christianity, like what Jesus would have done, sort of gets stomped on the bottom, and
exactly
we get 1,500 years of nothing really that's
exactly.
It's like, what do you think Jesus would say if like, let's say we're in the year 1500? Who's the Pope? Pope Borgia Alexander. What would he say if he came to the world and saw what was going on during that time period? He probably wouldn't be too happy about his church, right? I'm just saying.
Well, yeah, but you also, as I was saying, you as you were mentioning, I completely agree with you that a lot of the times the state did sort of hijack these types of things. Like you had the whole time period of like, who were those popes? Like that were sort of like in charge of things that were not the Machiavellis, but the
Medicis. Yeah,
Medici popes.
Same time period.
Yeah. So guy looked like Tony Soprano, by the way. Look it up. Pope Leo X, exact replica of Tony Soprano. But anyway,
nice.
He acted like it too.
Yeah, you totally had this idea where the state was sort of using the church. They're putting their buddies in charge of like this bishop appointment, or this pope is being, is sort of the hand of this Frankish government or this Italian government, this kind of thing. And so that's not coming directly from Christianity, though. That's the state using their systems in play to sort of push their own power, and the actual teachings of Christianity, as you said, are being pushed out to the side. So, of course, we wouldn't expect the ideas that we would see, these anti-slavery, these freedom ideas coming out of that sort of period when there's no breathing room for Christianity. It's all being used for state power.
Right, and it brings us back to the idea of having a centralized decree system of how Christianity should be run, which requires, if that's the case, now you require a strong centralized power.
I don't think so. I don't think you need a strong centralized power to have essential Christian doctrines. I think you need texts. That's why we have the New Testament that sort of define this idea. I think you need a church that sort of like works to sort of set parameters for what Christianity is. But I don't think you need a strong central power for sure. I think that would actually be more of a problem. I'm all against that kind of idea, especially but I don't want a strong central power.
And then how do you stop someone who comes along and says, I don't like this decree. I don't think there's a Trinity. I think that Jesus was a prophet. Or like, how do you stop those things then? You kind of need to have a strong centralized, you need to have church and state together to fix those things. And I think that's where the problem starts.
I think I would refer back to the teachings of Jesus where he said, let them go, they are blind, leading the blind. If you go, or in Matthew 10, if you go to a city and they reject your message, just dust the sandals off your feet and move on. It's not this idea we need to control that or fix that. That's just, you've presented the gospel, they reject it. Oh, well.
Right. No, I agree with that. And I think that should always be the mentality for any religious person. I believe this. I think this is what's going to happen to you when you die. I think this is what's going to happen to me when I die. You have every right to believe that. But it's like, at the same time, leave that person alone. Let them live their,
But then comes the element that I mentioned earlier of proselytization, where if not for that element, I'm not sure there would have been this embrace of Christianity by a centralized government. Because without that element, if it's just kind of like a pick whatever you want type of deal, like with paganism, but yeah, you're going to have to maybe give a penny to the emperor or whatever, it's no big deal. It does not strike me the same as a religion for which it's extremely important to spread it out to as many people as possible. Because that's not really, from what I understand, what was going on with the pagan religions, right?
Well, yeah, they were not proselytizing, but I mean, again, religion in the ancient world is a little bit different of a concept than what we think of. The pagans didn't say they were a pagan, that's their religion. Yeah. That was more interwoven with just the whole entire worldview and just their culture. I mean, everyone just sacrificed to Zeus. That's what the culture was. We today in the modern world separate religions out as something separate, and to them that wasn't a thing. Christianity comes on the scene, and it's an exclusivity thing that they struggle with, that the outside world struggles with. Why can't you sacrifice to the emperor and worship your god? What's the big problem here? And Christianity was advocating the idea that actually Jesus is king, not Caesar, which was a problem for the Romans. They didn't like that idea, and preaching this exclusivity idea, this idea that you can only worship Jesus, who is Yahweh, and no one else. And if you do that, that's wrong. And it just was a totally different thing to them. And that was, I think, the main issue for them.
Well, earlier Neil was talking about Christianity being compared to SJWs, and it reminded me of a very interesting article that I read in the Substack. I wish I could remember who wrote it, but they were talking about how the elites of that time when Christianity was starting to become a little bit more accepted, in the way they saw the writing on the wall, and they knew that they had to convert to Christianity now in order to fit in a way kind of like the banks today and various big corporations are converting to wokeness. So I don't know if that's a fair comparison or not.
No, I think that is a fair comparison. I mean, you do really see this as Christianity started growing. People just started converting because it was the cultural thing, and that's always a problem. That's not real Christianity. That's cultural Christianity.
Yeah, you also have the idea, Acts 2. I'm looking at Acts 2 right now, and it says all those who had believed were together and had all things in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, that any might have need. I mean, these are ideas that are kind of polar opposite of what you would see in some I don't know, Baptist church in South Carolina, where everybody's well, we have to have Trump win because we have to have a great economy. And they're worried about how the economy is and how good America's going to do. Whereas these Christians in these texts are worried about feeding the poor. And they don't care about, I'm agreeing with you. They don't care about Caesar or who's going to be the next Caesar or what Caesar's successor is. They don't care about none of that. They're caring about their church and their sort of lifestyle and how they're going to be good Christians, right?
Right. And anytime you start to make Christianity political, you're going to come into problems. It was never meant to be that.
Thank you. At least we agree on that. We agree on a lot of things.
Somebody in the chat here said this is one of the least mean-spirited debates of all time. So
not really a debate. We're discussing.
No, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess conversations kind of merge into debates and vice versa. Sure. It's never a 1-0 type of deal. At least not on Break the Rules, that is. But another very interesting thing for me to think about regarding this question of Christianity in today's world is going back to the idea of education and the knowledge of good and evil. Where do you think a lot of everyday people are at as far as today? I'm not talking about the Middle Ages, but today, their understanding, being bombarded with a lot of different information, their understanding of what it means to actually be a good person as opposed to pretending to be a good person, kind of like we're talking about wokeness before, where people try to perform as if they are a good person without necessarily understanding what it actually means to be good. Like, do you think it's the same that it was back in the day? Is it less so? Is it more so? Is there any way for us to even know that? Like the general feeling of a lot of people who happen to consider themselves to be Christians, at least on paper.
About what, if they think they're being good or not?
Yes, about whether they actually go through the steps to understand that, as opposed to just looking like they're good, looking like they're a good Christian, just going to church, just saying the right things. Like, how much is it actually happening within as opposed to without?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, we can't know unless we talk to each person, of course, and we can never really truly know. I do think it seems as though there is a lot of times Christians can fall into the idea of it's more about public appearance. Churches become more of country clubs where everyone has to appear good and fit in, and if you don't, then you're sort of kicked out or you're sort of shunned, which is a problem. And I think that is definitely a problem in the modern churches, where Christians are more focused on their appearance and how they look to the outside world versus actually trying to fix themselves from within and accept they're a sinner and accept they're not perfect. It becomes more of a pride issue. I have to look good to the outside world versus actually be good.
And then there's the other side of the coin when it comes to pagan faiths, where they participated in things like Saturnalia. From what I understand, Gnostic, you can talk a little bit more about this than me. It was pretty egalitarian in that whether or not you were a master or a slave, you got to participate in this festival. And from what I'm understanding, the entire point of a lot of these mystery cult initiation ceremonies is for you to gain a certain amount of gnosis, if you will, than you otherwise wouldn't. And it seems today there isn't really, I mean, again, we have Christianity, Islam, those are like the two big ones. We have esoteric Islam, which some people like Jason Giorgiani say that it's not really Islam, like they're pretending to be Muslim. Meanwhile, they're actually Mithraic cults. But as far as Christianity goes, there may be some like esoteric, like the Rosicrucians and whatever, the Freemasons. But generally speaking, most people don't engage in that kind of mystery school initiation. Do you think that that is something to be regretful about? That something like that may have also taken place within certain early Christian sects is not really something that people embrace, and instead we have this, looking like I'm being good without necessarily going through those motions?
Well, the Saturnalia thing is just like a traditional, holiday spirit, basically, which a lot of those themes we still have today during the holidays, like putting up wreaths on the wall and giving presents away. And this is all things that would be going on during Saturnalia festivals.
There were no wreaths.
Saturnalia, the wreaths come from Saturnalia. I can show you that. I could actually Mary Beard's Religions of Rome. I could show you the right where they have these ideas from. The idea
you're saying Christmas wreaths came from Saturnalia?
Yes. They're not called, they weren't called Christmas wreaths though. They were just wreaths. You hang up wreaths on your wall of your house during Saturnalia. That's a fact.
Yeah, I've done a lot of in the history of Christmas. There's no evidence anything comes from Saturnalia. That's like one of the big things I've done.
You're talking about wreaths. Okay. I don't know how we can settle that, but that's definitely part of my understanding.
Well, Neil, what are your sources for the wreaths?
Okay, I just said Mary Beard has done a lot of work on Religions of Rome. Saturnalia, though, the idea of Saturnalia, it was like, there was even they called it the King of Saturnalia, where they would take a common person and then put him in charge of like having power like the Caesar would. And they would like they tried to reverse the roles of society where everybody was equal just for this little time period. There was no status of plebeians and
patricians.
But yeah, everybody just sort of was like having just stop working and just enjoy yourself for this period of time up until December 23rd was when it stopped. Where was I going with this? Yeah, this is like, something like this is just traditional, festivals. These ideas, the Christmas festival, you have this celebration. Sol Invictus had their celebration around Christmas time, and then during the spring equinox, you have with Addis, you have the Holy Week of Addis from March 24th was the Day of Blood. Day of Blood, followed by another 3 days with a Day of Washing on December 27th or on March 27th. These festivals during the equinoxes were common throughout all these different religions. Now, does that mean that Christianity stole that from them? No, not at all. And I can actually explain how this would happen. Jesus goes down for Passover during one of these festivals, gets killed during that weekend, and that turns out to be the weekend. It just happened that way. They didn't say, "Oh, we got to copy Addis." There literally is a coincidence here. I agree with that. But what I'm pointing out is these festivals are so central to these societies and Roman civilization that they sort of Christianity sort of adapts to it. It seems like.
Yeah, the only thing I would push back is the whole Saturnalia thing on the whole Sol Invictus thing. I don't think Christmas traditions really go back to any of those. Like, for example, Christmas trees don't show up until Alsace, France in the 1500s in the Germanic region.
I don't know about that because you have the idea of cutting up. This happens in Egypt. This happens in Phoenicia. You have I'm not talking about for Christmas. I'm talking about for Osiris there was pine trees, and for Addis there was pine trees too. And then those are for the Holy Week of Osiris. Once a year, you would cut up a pine tree, and you would I forgot what they did with it, but I know for the case of Addis, they had this idea of placing a pine tree in a location and having it decorated with stuff.
Yeah, but I mean,
it's not a Christian thing. There's nowhere in the Bible where it says do that. I mean, these come from the pagan world.
So, scholars like Tanya Golovich will note that the Christmas tree most likely comes from paradise trees that were done in the Middle Ages. At December 24th was known as Adam and Eve's feast day, and they would typically celebrate it with a paradise tree decorated with apples. And of course, in Germany in the winter, the only trees available are going to be pine trees. So there's most likely more from that sort of custom, and that's why we don't see Christmas trees show up until the 1500s. It's not this idea it goes back to some sort of pagan thing they sort of like copied or borrowed or sort of took and repurposed. It probably just arose independently from European folk traditions.
Right. I mean, the Addis thing wasn't in December anyway. It was during the month of March. So I wasn't trying to say that the pine tree was for Christmas. But I will say, and I will stand by this, and maybe we can try to get someone to fact check this. The idea of putting wreaths up on the wall during Saturnalia was a thing. I will stand by that.
I'll double check on that, but I'm pretty sure Christmas wreaths would not come from that because again, they don't really start showing up into the Middle Ages.
All right, I'm gonna have to take a look as well, and let's see if this works. By the way,
you can.
It does work.
You can check out a video on my channel called Top 10 Christmas Traditions and Their Origins. And I go through Krampus, Father Christmas, Santa Claus, the date of Christmas, Yule logs. I show none of these, or mistletoe, none of them go back to paganism.
Oh, yeah, mistletoe. Mistletoe was something that I don't even know where that came from. That's something way different.
Yeah, it started in like the English service class in about the 1700s.
Yeah, because there's the myth of Balder, where the mistletoe, for some reason, is the only thing that hurts him. That's how he gets killed. You know that myth or not? Or it's in Jackson Crawford's translations of the text.
Yeah, the early poems. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting. So as far as this conversation goes, I think we can start to bring it to a close. And we're going to be doing super chats as well. So all the people out there, be sure to sneed those super chats for Santa here. And before that, though, Neil, would there be any other points that you would want to bring up as far as the various Christian sects go?
Yeah, the last thing I would say to Christians in general is that Christianity could survive in the modern world and be a powerhouse. Not just survive, but be a powerhouse if it stuck to apolitical ideology that focused on bettering society and not trying to put change, not trying to dictate other people's lives. That's what I would
So I would almost agree. I would say that yes, be apolitical, and I would say we don't not to necessarily dictate other people's lives, but try to call people and say that this is the best way to live in the Christian ideal. But yeah, I don't think anything should be forced upon anyone.
Sure.
So, that sounds good to me as well. So here we go. This is super chat time. And by the way, for all the people who are here who are also on Discord, Break the Rules does have a Discord server, and I would very much love for you guys to join us there. I'm going to be going to the farm. In fact, tomorrow I may be going to a farm where they're going to be shearing a sheep, you know, taking the wool, and I may be live streaming that on the Discord server if you guys want to check that out. So I just posted it in the chat right here. Be sure to join that. Once again, patreon.com/breaktherules. If you guys want some very beautiful rewards for becoming a patron, you are in luck, because my father, he hand creates these very beautiful wooden magnets, and these are going to be random designs for the $20 tier. For the $50 tier, if you are a fan of Styx Hexenhammer 666, you are going to get a beautiful Styx dragon. And if you are not a fan, or if you want a custom work, you can have a completely custom whatever design you want, within limits, of course, for you as a wooden magnet that my father is going to create. So that's up to you. And of course, the lower tier as well, we have the $5 tier, and that is going to be for general love and support from the Break the Rules people to you, as well as MP3s of the episodes after they come out, as well as Patreon-only content, which is going to be coming very soon. And the more that you guys support the channel, the more you help BTR grow, the more of this content is going to be able to be produced. And as always, don't forget to click that bell. The bell is extremely important, and hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. Here are the super chats, everybody. Okay, let's see here. Dems want to... I don't know if I should say this on YouTube, but it has to do with like certain procedures that are going on right now with children. Let's put it that way. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. It's very relevant in the news right now, but again, who knows how the YouTube algorithm treats this kind of stuff. Anyway, JDJW, who is, by the way, the current king of the Super Chat with a total of $40. You could see that in the ticker below over here. And if you want to usurp the rule of JDJW, you got to do more than 40. Anyway, JDJW for $10 says, I agree with damn near everything you guys are saying. I appreciate your knowledge and understanding. Tell me why old Greek literature describes wine red seas. No bullcrap, didn't see blue answers. I'm not sure what that means. Do you guys want to take a shot?
Yeah, I think in Homer's epics they talk about the sea is like as red as wine. And I think depending on
there's actually a phenomenon in Lebanon. It still happens to this day, right around springtime when the rains start coming down. The built up, forgot what kind of stone it is. It's like this red, oily stone, and it builds up during the wintertime. And then when the rains start falling, it washes it into the river. And they would call this, they'd named this river Adonis. It's now called the Abraham River. They changed it, but it was the river of Adonis. And they believed that this was the blood of Adonis washing out into the river. That was a phenomenon.
Yeah, I would say, like, when I've been on the ocean, you know, at least on the East Coast, it's sometimes in the evening or in the morning, the way the sun hits, the ocean can look kind of reddish, like kind of like a darkish red kind of thing. So, I mean, you could describe the sea as that way. I don't see that as an issue.
Interesting. So we have Jeanette McKinnon.
Real quick, I did find something on the Saturnalia thing. It's from Britannica.
All right.
Oh no, not Britannica. I have found errors in Britannica over and over again.
Well, I'll just read what it says. It says Saturnalia celebrations had a direct impact on Christmas and New Year. Celebrated the birth of the sun when houses decorated with greenery and lights and presents were given to children and the poor.
So I have read
I
Macrobius'
can
book.
find other scholars that have said the same thing too.
I have read Macrobius' book on Saturnalia. He does not mention decorating with like greenery or pine or anything
Actually,
like
are
that.
you sure? Because I think Macrobius is one of the sources that says this. I'm pretty sure.
I think he mentions them making certain types of wreaths, but not with pine.
I didn't say pine. I didn't say that.
Okay, well then, yeah. I mean, but I don't think Christmas wreaths came from Saturnalia, or any Christmas tradition came from Saturnalia.
Out of curiosity, what is your take on the John Marco Allegro theories with like the sacred mushroom and the cross and all that? I mean, that's like a whole other conversation, but I wanted to throw that in there for all the Joe Rogan fans.
Yeah, he makes his argument from like two things, like some frescoes from the Middle Ages, which are trees he thinks are mushrooms, and he tries to say that somehow Semitic languages are connected to Sumerian words through like Indo-European. It's a total hypothesis. There's not a lot of good evidence for it, but he tries to say that certain words, Semitic words, are somehow related to Sumerian words. Again, no evidence for it, just a total hypothesis, conjecture, but that's his argument, and there's no evidence to support what he's making these connections.
So, from what I understand, the Semitic language comes from originally it's connected to the Phoenician language, which is connected to the Egyptian hieroglyphics. As far as the Sumerian language, how does that end up getting transferred, if it does get transferred into any other language over time? Do you know? Like, it may be out of your wheelhouse, but I was always kind of curious about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably out of my wheelhouse there. Sorry.
No problem at all. Later on. Actually, Neil, I want to ask you the same question. So, just a slight interest of mine here. When Michael was talking about how John Marco Allegro attributed the translation of the Sumerian words into Hebrew, and that justified his view of this link between the psychedelics and Christianity, Michael disagrees with that. What do you know about the connection with the Sumerian language into any other language? Because, like I said, the Hebrew language came from, if I'm not mistaken, Semitic, but it came from the alphabetization of the Egyptian hieroglyphics through the Phoenician language, right?
Well, the alphabet of the Phoenicians is where is the Hebrew alphabet.
Yeah, exactly. But as far as the Sumerian language, did that one go through any similar kind of transformation over time, or was it just like those strange looking lines? And
cuneiform.
Yeah, cuneiform, and it never really turned into anything else, right?
No, but the cuneiform, the people who use cuneiform end up adopting the Phoenician script eventually. That's where Aramaic from.
Got it. All right, here we go. JDJW, $10. I love debates. You guys are awesome. But we only move forward if we acknowledge the past and accept future possibilities. Let's all just use this genius for the right now. Thank you so much, JDJW. And the final super chat, unless there's going to be any other ones happening here, is from Jelly Drags, $9.99. What? Oh, I think I missed one here. I do not want to miss this one. It was about the Trump people. Here, let me see if I could find it.
Trump people.
Yeah, the Trump people. Let me see where it was. Oh, here we go. It was from Jeanette McKinson. What do you think Christians would say about radical Trump Christians today?
I mean, I'm all against this idea that Trump is a messiah and that Christianity is like. The Christians should be like using Christianity to support that. If you want to vote for it, keep it separate from Christianity. That needs to be important. I did a video on Christian nationalism with the help of a sociologist, Kenneth Vaughn, a few months ago. Does Christianity cause Christian nationalism? And we just, talked about a lot of stuff in there related to this. But no, I do not think that that this idea should come out of Christianity. And there's some studies that show that it actually does not.
There we go.
And I think the best example of why Christians today, why the Trump-loving Christians today are completely, they should be called heretics. And just look at what Jesus says when he's handed the coin of Caesar. He says, what does he say? Mike, what does Jesus say when he's handed the coin of Caesar?
He says, be sure to pay your taxes.
Right, but he's
basically render to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Render to Caesar what is Caesar, but render what to God what is God's.
Mm-hmm.
And he says things often throughout the text where it's these trivial matters of the world of the archons, the rulers of this world. Paul talks about this too. This is not the world that we're supposed to be concerned about. Christianity, you're supposed to carry your cross. If you like the first 300 years of Christianity, they lived under a world that they had it didn't like reflect their worldview, basically. But that was part of being a Christian. You're supposed to endure that. Christians today complain about everything. Not you, or I'm saying like I'm talking specifically about this Trump Christian. Not talking about. I should have reworded that. The
Christian nationalists.
Christian nationalists today complain about every little detail. That's not the Christian way. That's why they should be called heretics.
And Christian nationalists, a lot of them also want the government to become a theocratic one to enforce Christianity. So here we go.
Just on the record, I am incredibly opposed to Christian nationalism.
Right.
Incredibly opposed.
Same here, brother. So here we go. Jelly Drags, $9.99. What is the overarching significance of clustering God with Jesus if you extrapolate the same lessons from Jesus as a teacher who had glimmers of God's light shine through him? Am I missing something?
Yeah, so why do we say that Jesus has to be God? Seems to be the thing. Why not just a teacher at God's light shining through him? Well, for one, we believe that this is what the New Testament teaches. I mean, we don't want to say that, not take Jesus at his word when we see this in the Gospels and in Paul's letters, that he very much is Yahweh in the flesh. So that's important there. And I also think it's related to salvation, this idea that, we need God who is going to be the true Savior. It's not this idea that a human can save us. It's much more it's a much more deep and interesting connection with God when he's the one who comes and saves us himself. I mean, Albert Camus, for example, who was an atheist, said Christ, the man God, can no longer have evil entirely imputed to him, because he comes and he suffers and dies for us. He comes, he puts himself on the cross. He doesn't sit on his throne and expect a servant to do it for him. He comes, lives the life we should have lived, dies the death we should have died, and calls us to follow him, to pick up our cross and follow after God, who showed us how to do it properly. So it's a much more profound message when it is God himself who comes and dies, and not just he gets a human servant to do it for him.
Now, I am kind of curious whether Camus was like full atheist or whether he just did not embrace the organized religion that he grew up with.
As far as I can tell, he seemed to be an atheist. But when you get to some of these philosophers, sometimes they sort of wrestle with different ideas, and there's always ambiguity in there.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think this is pretty much it. I mean, there was so much. Yes.
Neil, if you ever want to do a conversation on Christmas origins, I'm all happy to. Yeah, I've got videos on my channel called Christmas is Not Pagan, Easter's Not Pagan, Halloween is Not Pagan, St. Valentine's Day is not pagan, and I go into all the history of that.
We got to have that discussion. I'm looking at Mary Beard's right now, and it's matching exactly what the Britannica thing said.
What is her source?
Well, it's Mary Beard, man. She's the go-to on this stuff, Roman religion.
Yeah, but when you write something in the book, don't you have
she has images of these altars. Look at this.
All right, let's see.
Hold on a second. I just lost the page. I'm sorry. I'll get it right now.
No problem. Everybody, by the way, subscribe to Break the Rules. While Neil is fiddling around with the pages, you know what you got to do. Subscribe to BTR right now. You know it. You love it. BTR is the future. We're bringing everybody together, people who otherwise would not have a chance to speak to each other. Not so much with Michael and Gnostic, because I think that they are great people. They're already together, linked up by the Holy Spirit, which is Derek. But be that as it may, we are bringing Alexander Bard together with Daniele Bellelli, and that is happening a week from now, so look forward to that. And also this week, Catherine Brodsky and Josh Lakash are back. They have never been on the same stream together, but nevertheless, they are back, and that's going to be a very interesting stream. We may be talking about Kanye and the current thing that's going on right now. And let's see. I don't know if I should announce this yet, if this is happening or not, because I did a intro to a certain person here. I introed the idea to him of doing a debate about pit bulls, and he wrote LOL. I'm not sure if does that Does that mean yes? I'm not going to say who it is yet, but when you find out, you guys are going to be like, Psh, oh my God, he's back. So I'm not going to say who it is yet if this does indeed happen. I'm going to will it to happen because that would be amazing if he comes back on for a debate about pit bulls, whether it is the dog or whether it is the owner. In fact, while Neil is fiddling around, Michael, what is your take on pit bulls? Is it the dog predisposition to being aggressive, or is it the kind of owners that the pit bulls have that cause them to act in such a way towards the those yummy infants that they gobble up like candy?
I think we can all agree the most dangerous dog is the Chihuahua. So let's just remember that. They're the most angry dog out there. I think it can probably be a combination of both. You can have dogs that are more prone to aggression. You can have humans more prone to making dogs aggressive. I don't think there's just one simple answer for all.
But it is weird though how you have this one breed that's responsible for so much of the attacks on people, pets, especially like the infants. Like that would say something about, I guess, I don't know, like it's rare. It's very weird. Like you have the pit bulls, and then right below you have the Rottweilers. But the Rottweilers, it's not as many bites as the pit bulls. Oh, and one final super chat from JDJW, $2. I'll come on and talk about anything. Well, I would love to have you, buddy. We should definitely do some kind of a stream together there. So yeah, I will see if he says yes or not. But otherwise, those two streams are down the line. And once again, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. You're going to get all this enjoyable stuff. Like, share, subscribe. Neil, how are you doing on that document?
Well, let me tell you about what does this sound like to you?
Okay.
The festival involved private parties extending over several days, exchange of gifts, and customs became incorporated into Christian celebrations of New Year and Christmas. That's very weird.
I would say that, books like this, for example, note the origin of Christmas gift giving goes back to the early 1800s.
Wait, so these sources are wrong then?
I mean, I'm citing scholars when they
I'm
say
citing
this type
Mary
of thing.
Beard, PhD.
So then my response to this always is where do we see Christians giving gifts on Christmas in like the 700s, 800s?
You know what I say? You know what I say about all this?
What?
Forget about the scholars. Let's go to the primary sources. If I can find you primary sources from a writer in Latin or Greek from the first century BC, we're done. Like there's nothing you can.
Here's the thing:
you can cite a Christian scholar all day. I could show you the primary source.
Well, these are not Christian scholars; these are just scholars.
I'm just saying in general. Obviously I don't have them with me, but I doubt Mary Beer is just making this up. That's what I'm saying.
I would say is a gift giving. We have to remember is something that happens in a lot of cultures on a lot of festivals,
during the same week as December 25th.
Again, Christmas gift giving does not come about until within the past 100 years. There's a huge hundreds of years in between Saturnalia dying out and Christmas starting their own gift giving traditions.
I'll have to check on that. I can't say you're wrong or right because I don't know for sure. But I just have a hard time believing that it would die out. I think it might carry out. I think Christmas has always been a thing for a long time.
I mean, it has been since Christians were celebrating, the birth of Jesus. But I mean, like certain Christmas traditions, like for example, decorating a pine tree did not come out to the 1500s.
Oh no, I was
Yule logs.
The pine tree thing. That's an Addis thing, and that's in the springtime. That's something different.
Yeah.
I wasn't saying that.
But I mean, like certain Christmas traditions.
My claim is decorating the house, decorating not just the house, but all of Rome with greenery and giving presents and stopping all work and just having a festival is an idea that predates Christianity. I'll stand by that. We can have a show. Okay.
I think those ideas predate Christianity. My argument is that the Christmas traditions they didn't like come from the pagans. For example, they note in this book that sometimes these customs sort of develop on their own in different cultures.
So do you think Jesus was actually born on December 25th?
No.
Okay, so doesn't that defeat the purpose of even wanting to care about that?
No, the early Christians thought Jesus would die on the same day he was conceived. They thought he was conceived on March 25th. You just count forward 9 months. That's why they picked December 25th.
Oh, so you think he actually was born on that day?
No, early Christians thought that, but I'm not sure if he was.
Oh, yeah, because I think it does say in the text that there's shepherds in the field, which would like give the idea that it's harvest time. So I've heard some scholars say that before. They said that he might have been born around September or October.
Yeah, but December of 25th wasn't picked because of any pagan holiday or anything like that.
I think it was. I think that's what Constantine was trying to. He was trying to make happy the Sol Invictus people who definitely revered. This is a fact. I can show.
No, it's not. Sol Invictus. There's no sources that say Sol Invictus was on December 25th, prior to 354 AD, which is in the Philocalian calendar. Prior to that, Aurelian worshipped the sun. Aurelian worshipped the sun every 4 years with chariot races in October. The Fasti inscriptions do not mention any festivals on December 25th. Ronald Hutton.
Payam Nabar's PhD of Oxford University. Let's see what he has to say about this.
Okay. Ronald Hutton, for example, also notes we have no evidence of any sort of festivals from the Romans on December 25th. They debated about which day was the winter solstice, but even they did not treat it as a specific holiday. They just sort of treated it as a celestial event. But again, Christians picked it because of their own calculations. We have no evidence of any pagan holiday on December 25th prior to 354 AD in the Philocalian calendar. And I can cite people like Roger Beckworth, Ronald Hutton.
According to the Zoroastrian tradition, Mithra the Savior, born in 272 BCE, born on the winter solstice.
Nope. No evidence of that. Roger Beckworth is soundly. There is not any ancient sources. No.
This is my thing. Whenever I get into these discussions with people, because I got a scholar right here. You got a scholar too. Let's throw these out the window. Let's go to the sources.
Okay.
Let's see if I can find a pre-Christian source that
says Mithra. I will donate $20.
That it's not December 25th. I will say it's on the winter solstice. December 25th might have just came. Something else must have happened with that.
Mithra was born on December 25th, or on the
during the winter solstice. That's a fact. He's the incomparable sun. The sun starts to rise. Lose its lowest point in the sky after December 23rd. That's not.
I would be very interested if you could find a source saying that, because I have looked and I cannot find any dates for Mithra's birthday.
I actually know of a Christian source. Clement of Alexandria says this.
He says that Mithra.
Exhortation to the Greeks. No, he doesn't say about Mithra. Clement of Alexandria says that the pagans revered the winter solstice because it's the day the sun rises up.
That's not saying Mithra was born on that day.
I don't know if he says Mithra in particular, but he's acknowledging that these other religions of his time, which would be Sol Invictus, had this sort of thing. So I have to get the details on that. I don't have it in front of me, but I can confidently say that he says something about he acknowledges it.
I'll just say Roger Beck says this in Murbach's Mithra, his paper. He says, in truth, the only evidence for it is the celebration of the birthday Invictus on the date in the calendar of Philocalus. Invictus, of course, Sol Invictus, Aurelian sun god. It does not follow that a different earlier and unofficial sun god, Sol Invictus Mithras, was necessarily or even probably born on that day. So he says the only evidence of any sort of birthday of some sort of sun deity was in, again, the Philocalian calendar, 354 AD. Prior to that, we don't have anything.
But like I said, you're referencing a scholar. I just reference a scholar. Who wins? We're just at odds. We got to go to the sources. So fair
enough.
And I could be wrong. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. If you're right, you're right. If I can't pull up a source, I'll just be, yeah, you got that one. You know.
Fair enough. I would love to see, if you can find it, though, please send it to me immediately. I'd love to.
Yeah, no, I just have fun doing this kind of stuff. So it's not, you know.
So a quick announcement, JDJW, you can email me in the contact info on Break the Rules, or you can make a Twitter account and just quickly message me at twitter.com/LevPo. Speaking of which, all the people who are watching here, if you want to hear more quips and dad jokes from Lev here, twitter.com/LevPo, LEVPO. Follow me on Twitter this instant. I'm also going to post art, animation, all that good stuff. JDJW, please get in touch with me, because I don't think the mystery guest is going to say yes. If he does say yes, that is going to be earth-shattering, but I'm not sure he will. So instead, I think the likeliest thing is that this week we are going to do a debate on pit bulls. And JDJW is going to be on with Spinach Bra, who is very much against pit bulls, and it's going to be a very fun experience, Patreon only. And if you become a patron, you are also going to get an opportunity to be in the debate itself as well, not just as the audience in the chat, but actually being able to participate and ask questions live and all that kind of stuff. So it should be a fun time for all. So yeah, you can also try the Discord server, and this is going to be another plug for the Discord server. Join Discord right now. I don't care how you get in touch with me, but please, JDJW, get in touch with me, all right? There's also an email, which is my name, Lev Polyakov at gmail.com. That's another way that you can get in touch with me. So you know my name, you know where it is. And lastly, but not leastly, plugs for you guys. So, Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy. Is there anything that you would want to promote? And how do you think things are going to go in the next year for Inspiring Philosophy? What plans do you have?
So I'm going to finish up my series on the documentary hypothesis. I have a lot of videos I want to do on that. So I'll probably do that for a while. But I'm also going to do a series on eschatology and if Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. Do some more stuff on New Testament reliability. I'm going to make a case for post-millennialism, a view of eschatology. But this Friday on my channel, I'm doing something I don't normally do. I'm going to review the show Rings of Power on Amazon because I'm an avid supporter of Tolkien's philosophy. I've read books called Tolkien's Philosophy, and they butchered his philosophy to the point where I'm just so angry how they ruined it.
I didn't know that.
I'm going to go into Tolkien's philosophy. I'm going to show how the show gets it wrong, how they are inserting ideas they get from George R.R. Martin's books into Tolkien's world. It's horrible.
It's heresy, man. It's heresy.
It is.
That's Tolkien the real heresy right there. Exactly. Oh, man, I am looking forward to that. And where can people find you? I mean, your channel, obviously, but...
Yeah, you can find me on TikTok. I do a lot of comedy replies on there to people, like some crazy New Agers sometimes. Of course, you can find me on YouTube, where I do a lot of videos, as well as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Excellent.
And Gnostic Informant, Neil, what do you have cooking in your Gnostic kitchen?
YouTube.com/Gnostic Informant. And let's see, I'm working on a video about the Herodian dynasty. I have a video about the Apocrypha, Dr. Tony Burke, who has done so much work in early Christian origins. He has 2 books already translating Apocrypha texts that no one's even heard of. He's got a 3rd one coming out next March. I had him on. I just did a pre-record with him. I'm editing that now. So we're going to talk about some of these Christian texts that most people never even heard of. And that stuff that's coming down the line. I also have a video with a scholar on a Native American religion, which is pretty fun. So we got some videos coming out.
Welcome to
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. And guys, be sure to subscribe to everybody here and subscribe to Break the Rules. Super Chat's already gone. Smash that subscribe button and smash the bell. The bell is extremely important. Thank you guys so much for watching. Till next time, be well.